Mr. Hogan, before we proceed, I'd like to ask something.
Oh, a question?
Mm-hmm.
I didn't realize you were actually following the conversation.
Sweetheart, do us all a favor. Let the people who belong in this room do the talking.
Gilbert turned his back to Dove completely and shifted his attention to the other investors.
Now then, do any of our actual attendees have questions?
Dove's gaze didn't waver from Gilbert. She remained poised, her hands resting lightly on top of the unsigned agreement. What Gilbert didn't know was that he had just spent 53 minutes ignoring the one woman whose signature could destroy everything he had spent his entire life trying to inherit. Before continuing, comment where in the world you are watching from, and make sure to subscribe, because tomorrow's story is one you can't miss. The elevator opened on the 42nd floor, and Dove Wermer-Hartson already knew. She could feel it before she stepped off, before the doors parted, before the sharp smell of expensive coffee and new carpet hit her. She had been in enough rooms like this to recognize the atmosphere before she walked into it. Some rooms decide who you are the moment you arrive. She stepped out anyway. The conference room at Nova Bridge Technologies was the kind of room designed to make people feel small. Floor-to-ceiling windows, a mahogany table the length of a school bus, 14 leather chairs, most of them already filled with men in dark suits, who barely glanced up when Dove and her sister, Shane, entered. Dove was 37 years old. She ran a $2 billion firm. She had built every single piece of it herself, starting with nothing but a laptop, a borrowed office, and a mother who worked nights so Dove could study days. She wore a deep burgundy blazer and carried a black leather portfolio that held, among other things, the terms for a $700 million investment. Nobody offered her a seat. A woman, Carmela Lindstrom, Nova Bridge's head of investor relations, appeared with a tight smile and directed Shane toward the far end of the table. Shane was Dove's younger sister and her chief investment officer. She was 28, brilliant, and right now deeply unimpressed. She shot Dove a quick look as they were steered to the far end of the table, like they'd wandered in from the wrong floor. Dove said nothing. She sat. She placed her portfolio in front of her, folded her hands on top of it, and waited. At 9:03, Gilbert Hogan walked in. He was 34, sandy-haired, broad-shouldered, the kind of handsome that comes from good genetics and expensive grooming. He moved like a man who had never once in his life been made to feel unwelcome in a room. His suit fit perfectly. His smile was easy and wide and completely automatic. He went straight to the two white male analysts seated near the center of the table. "Marcus, good to see you, man. You make it in from New York last night?" Handshakes, laughs. A brief enthusiastic exchange about a golf course in Scottsdale. Then Peter Wendale, the company's chairman of the board, silver-haired, 66 years of connected money in his posture, rose halfway from his chair and extended a hand. Gilbert clasped it with both of his, the kind of greeting reserved for family. Dove watched. Neither man looked her way. She wrote one word in her portfolio. Small, clean letters in the upper right corner of the first blank page. Noted. Carmela began distributing presentation packets around the table. She placed one in front of Shane. She placed one in front of each of the male analysts. She walked directly past Dove without pausing. Shane's hand tightened around her pen. Dove didn't move. Gilbert called the meeting to order with the relaxed confidence of someone who had never once questioned his right to call anything to order. He stood at the head of the table, clicker in hand, first slide glowing on the screen behind him. "Gentlemen, and of course, team," he said, his eyes moving around the room in a wide, generous arc that somehow managed to skip Dove entirely. "Welcome. Today is a big day for Nova Bridge, and I want to make sure we take our time and really walk our guests through the full vision." His eyes landed on Shane. He smiled at her. "We're really excited to have Apex Capital in the room today. Really excited." Shane blinked. Then, slowly, she turned to look at Dove. Dove was already looking at Gilbert. Her expression was calm, patient, the way a surgeon's face is calm before the first incision. Gilbert's eyes moved past her like she was part of the furniture. He clicked to slide 2 and began talking about market share. Dove let him. She uncapped her pen. She listened to every word. She caught every number. She noted every omission, every gap, every carefully worded sentence that was designed to make something ugly look clean. She had been doing this since she was 24 years old, sitting in rooms that didn't think she belonged there, listening to men explain things she already understood better than they did. The difference was, she was patient. She had always been patient. And patience, she had learned a long time ago, was the most expensive thing in any room. She wrote a second word beneath the first. Waiting. 20 minutes in, and Gilbert Hogan had not looked at Dove once. Not once. She had counted. The presentation was moving fast, slides clicking past, numbers stacking on top of numbers, Gilbert's voice filling the room like he was performing for an audience that only included the people he had already decided mattered. He was good at it, Dove had to admit. He had the rhythm of a man who had rehearsed this pitch many times in front of mirrors and friendly faces. Smooth, confident, completely hollow underneath. She waited for her moment. It came during the debt restructuring segment. Gilbert pulled up a slide that showed Nova Bridge's Q3 financial breakdown, a clean, color-coded chart that made everything look tidy and deliberate. Dove had studied these numbers for 3 weeks. She knew where the bodies were buried. She leaned forward slightly and spoke with calm, measured clarity. "Can you walk us through the liability exposure in the Southeast Corridor?" It wasn't in the pre-meeting materials. The room kept moving. Gilbert kept talking. Not a pause, not a flicker, not even the small, polite acknowledgement of someone who had heard a question and chosen to defer it. He simply continued, mid-sentence, rolling directly from one point to the next, as though Dove's voice had been nothing but air moving through the room. Shane's head turned sharply toward her sister. Dove didn't react. She wrote in her portfolio, "Asked, ignored. 9:27 a.m. Carmela Lindstrom, stationed near the projector like a well-dressed sentry, shifted slightly and angled the next printed handout toward Shane. Not reaching across Dove, not acknowledging that Dove was sitting right there. Just redirecting. Smooth and practiced, the way you redirect water around a rock. Then Peter Wendell cleared his throat and leaned toward Shane with the relaxed confidence of a man who had never once been told he was wrong about anything. "I have to be honest with you," he said, not bothering to lower his voice. "We were expecting the principal on this account to be present today. Someone with the authority to actually move this forward. Is there any chance she's running behind? We really do need a decision-maker in the room." The words landed like a brick through glass. Shane went completely still. Dove was sitting directly across from him. 18 inches of mahogany table between them. Her name was on every document in that room. Her signature was on the letters of intent. Her firm's logo was printed on the cover of the meeting brief that Carmela had handed out 23 minutes ago. And Peter Wendell was asking Shane if the decision-maker was planning to show up. Shane opened her mouth. Dove touched her sister's wrist. Once. Light as a feather. Not yet. Shane closed her mouth. Her jaw was so tight Dove could see the muscle working beneath the skin. Peter waited 2 seconds, received only silence, and turned back to Gilbert with a small, satisfied smirk. The look of a man who had just confirmed exactly what he already believed. Gilbert clicked to the next slide. Dove raised her hand. "The Q3 liability gap I mentioned earlier," she said, her voice even and clear. "I'd like that addressed before we move forward." This time, Gilbert's eyes moved. He turned toward her with an expression that was somehow worse than being ignored. A slow, patient smile, the kind you give a child who has interrupted the grown-ups. "I love the enthusiasm," he said warmly. in a tone that made the word enthusiasm sound like a polite substitute for something far less kind. He turned immediately to the analyst 3 chairs down without missing a beat. "Hey, why don't you walk everybody through the Q3 summary? Nice and simple. Make sure the whole room is on the same page. Nice and simple." As though the question had come from someone who didn't understand the material. As though Dove had raised her hand because she was lost, not because she had identified a deliberate, specific omission buried in their financials. As though nice and simple was what she needed. The analyst shuffled forward in his chair and began reciting numbers Dove had already memorized. Shane pressed her pen against the notepad in front of her so hard the tip punched through the paper. Dove let the analyst talk. She wrote in her portfolio. Nice and simple. Redirected. Twice. Analyst used as a buffer. 9:34 a.m. She looked at Shane, just briefly. Just long enough for her sister to see the expression she had known her whole life. It wasn't anger. It wasn't hurt. It was something far steadier and far more dangerous than either of those things. It was recognition. I see exactly what you are doing. I see every single piece of it. And I am writing all of it down. The analyst finished. Gilbert thanked him with genuine enthusiasm. The same enthusiasm he had never once offered Dove. And moved to the next slide. Dove turned to a fresh page. She had a feeling she was going to need it. 53 minutes. That was how long Gilbert Hogan had been talking. At the room, past Dove, around Dove, through Dove, without once directing a single meaningful word at the woman whose signature could end his career or save it. 53 minutes. Dove knew because she had written down the time when the meeting started. She wrote down a lot of things. It was a habit she had developed years ago, sitting in rooms exactly like this one. Documentation was its own kind of power. Quiet, patient, irrefutable. Gilbert was mid-sentence on Nova Bridge's 5-year infrastructure roadmap when Dove's phone buzzed against the table. She glanced at the screen. Then she silenced it without a word and set it face down. She wasn't the kind of woman who took personal calls in the middle of a meeting. That wasn't how she operated. That had never been how she operated. But someone, apparently, was not willing to wait. Because 30 seconds later, the conference room's landline rang. The sound cut through Gilbert's presentation like a fire alarm. Nobody moved for a moment. These lines almost never rang during booked meetings. Carmela Lindstrom recovered first, crossing to the credenza with a brisk, slightly irritated efficiency and lifting the handset. Nova Bridge Technologies. This is Carmela. She stopped. Whatever was said on the other end, it erased the practiced calm right off her face. Her eyes moved immediately. Not to Gilbert, not to Peter, but across the table to Dove. Something flickered behind them. Confusion first. Then a look Dove recognized instantly. She had seen it 100 times, in 100 rooms. It was the look of someone rapidly revising their assumptions. Carmela crossed the room and held the handset out toward Dove. Her voice was careful now. Quieter. Ms. Wermer-Hartson, it's Senator Aldridge's office. They say it's regarding the Friday allocation. They specifically requested you. The room went absolutely still. Not the polite professional stillness of people observing meeting etiquette. The frozen, airless stillness of people recalibrating everything they thought they knew. Gilbert's clicker hand lowered slowly to the table. Peter Wendale's chin came up a fraction of an inch. The two male analysts exchanged a quick glance that they both immediately regretted. Dove stood, accepted the handset, with the unhurried ease of someone who received calls from senators' offices regularly. Because she did. And stepped to the far end of the room. She kept her back straight and her voice low and professional. She spoke for less than 45 seconds. The only words that carried clearly across the room were the ones she didn't try to hide. Tell him the terms stay as filed. The full 700. Friday holds. She returned the handset to Carmela without ceremony, walked back to her seat, sat down, and looked at Gilbert. "I apologize for the interruption," she said. "Please continue." Nobody continued anything. Peter Wendale's hands, which had been loosely folded on the table, were now pressed flat against the mahogany. He was staring at Dove with an expression that had moved well past surprise and arrived somewhere closer to cold, private alarm. Carmela had already returned to her laptop. Her fingers moved quickly, too quickly, the frantic typing of someone trying to catch up to a mistake already made. 40 seconds. Then she leaned forward and slid a single printed sheet in front of Gilbert, without a word. Gilbert looked down at it. Dove watched his face. It was the specific experience of watching a man understand something he could not ununderstand. The color changed first, a slow drain from confidence to something paler and considerably less certain. His jaw shifted. His eyes moved left to right across the page with the rapid, involuntary focus of someone who is reading words that are actively rearranging the furniture of everything he believed 30 seconds ago. The sheet was brief. One page, clean and factual and absolutely devastating in its simplicity. Dove Wermer Hartson, founder and managing principal, Apex Capital Group. Assets under management, $2.1 billion. Personal net worth, $1.4 billion. Current pending deployment, $700 million, infrastructure sector. The full 700 she had just confirmed on that call, the terms filed, the Friday deadline, the allocation, was the exact investment package sitting at the center of this meeting. The number wasn't some distant abstract figure from another deal in another city. It was this deal. It was this room. It was the single transaction Gilbert Hogan needed to close to prove to his father that he deserved the title on his office door. And the woman who controlled every dollar of it had been sitting at the end of his table for 53 minutes while he talked over her, around her, and through her like she was part of the wallpaper. Gilbert looked up from the sheet. Dove looked back at him. She did not smile. She did not raise an eyebrow. She simply held his gaze with the calm, patient stillness of someone who had known exactly how this moment would arrive long before he did. She had just been waiting for him to catch up. The silence lasted exactly 4 seconds. Dove counted them the way she counted everything in rooms like this, quietly, precisely, without moving a muscle. 4 seconds was a long time in a boardroom, long enough for every person at that table to feel the weight of what had just shifted, long enough for Gilbert Hogan to make a decision about who he was going to be next. He made the wrong one. His face reorganized itself into something that was almost convincing. The wide, easy smile came back first, the one that lived on the surface of his face, like a piece of furniture that had always been there. His shoulders dropped, his chin came up. He set the printed profile face down on the table with a small, casual motion, as though he were simply clearing space, as though Carmela had handed him a grocery receipt. Then he turned toward Dove with the grand, generous energy of a man unveiling a gift. "You know what?" he said, spreading his hands open on the table like he was offering her something. "I feel like we have completely dropped the ball here today. Completely. That is on me." He shook his head with a theatrical self-reproach that didn't reach his eyes. "Ms. Wermer Hartson, Dove, I would love to just stop everything and hear directly from you. Your vision, your priorities. What does a partnership like this look like from where you're sitting?" He leaned back in his chair and crossed his arms, settling in with the relaxed attentiveness of a man who believed he had just corrected a minor oversight, and fully expected to be thanked for it. Shane's pen stopped moving. She looked at her sister with an expression that said, very clearly, "Please, don't let him get away with this." Dove looked at Gilbert. She let the moment breathe, not to be dramatic, not to perform confidence she didn't feel. She let it breathe because she wanted him to sit inside his own performance for just a few seconds longer, to feel how thin it was, how transparent, how completely unconvincing to the only person in the room it was aimed at. Then she spoke. Your Q3 infrastructure projections show a 12% growth assumption in the Southeast Corridor, she said. Her voice was calm and even, the same voice she used to read the morning news. But the corridor's two largest municipal contracts expired in August, and neither has been renewed. That assumption isn't supported by anything currently on file. Gilbert's smile held. Barely. The liability exposure I asked about earlier, the one your team redirected away from me, she continued with the same unhurried precision, corresponds to an undisclosed gap in your Q3 debt restructuring report. Specifically, the variance between your reported obligations and your actual outstanding balances in the Southeast portfolio. One of the analysts reached for his papers. Peter Wendale took his glasses off. And finally, Dove said, the pre-meeting materials your office sent to Apex Capital last Thursday were missing the Southeast Corridor liability schedule entirely. I'd like to understand whether that was an oversight or a decision. The last sentence landed in the room like a stone dropped into still water. Quiet, precise, and spreading in every direction at once. Nobody spoke. Gilbert's smile was gone. In its place was something he was working very hard to keep off his face. Not anger, not embarrassment, but something rawer and less manageable than either of those things. He looked like a man who had just been shown a mirror he wasn't expecting. Peter Wendale was completely still. He was looking at Dove the way you look at something you suddenly understand you have badly miscalculated. Carmela Lindstrom's hands were in her lap. She was not typing. Dove closed her portfolio. The soft click of the clasp was the only sound in the room. She stood. Shane rose immediately behind her. The practiced, seamless movement of two women who had been navigating rooms like this one together for years. Dove picked up her portfolio and looked at Gilbert one last time. Not with anger. Not with satisfaction. With the same level, patient expression she had worn for the entire 57 minutes of this meeting. I'll have my team send your office our decision by end of week, she said. Then she walked toward the door. Behind her, she heard the sound of Gilbert Hogan saying something, beginning a sentence that started with, Dove, if we could just... She didn't slow down. She didn't turn around. She had said everything she needed to say. In 3 sentences. In under 90 seconds. That was the thing about patience. When it finally ended, it ended completely. The elevator doors closed behind them with a soft, final click. For a moment, neither sister spoke. The floor numbers descended in silence. 42, 41, 40. Small amber lights blinking one after another like a countdown. The elevator was polished steel and expensive lighting, the kind designed to make you feel important on the way up and reflective on the way down. Dove stood straight, portfolio tucked under her arm, eyes forward. Shane stood beside her with her arms crossed tight against her chest, the way she had crossed them as a little girl when she was working very hard not to say something she couldn't take back. They made it to the 38th floor before Shane broke. He talked over you 4 times, she said. Her voice was low and tight. 4. And Peter. That thing he said to me about the principal not being in the room. She stopped, pressed her lips together. Dove, he was looking right at you when he said it. I know, Dove said. That wasn't accidental. I know that too. So we're pulling the investment. Dove looked at the descending numbers. We're sending them our decision by end of week, she said. Like I told them. Shane turned to look at her sister fully. That's not an answer. It's the only answer I'm giving right now. Shane exhaled through her nose. Sharp, controlled frustration. The specific sound of a woman who had grown up watching her older sister refuse to be rattled, and had never fully decided whether to admire it or be maddened by it. Usually both. The elevator reached the lobby. The doors slid open onto the wide, marble-floored entrance of Nova Bridge's building. All glass and polished stone, the kind of lobby designed to communicate importance to anyone walking through it. A security guard near the front desk looked up briefly and looked away. They walked out into the cool Chicago morning. Dove's town car was at the curb. Her driver, a quiet man named Earl who had worked for her for 6 years, stepped out and opened the rear door without being asked. Dove paused before getting in, tilting her face slightly toward the October air. Just for a second. The kind of second that belongs only to yourself. Then Shane's phone rang. The sound was ordinary. Just a ringtone. The same one Shane had used for 2 years. But something in the timing of it made Dove turn. She watched her sister's face as Shane lifted the phone to her ear, watched the small frown appear between her brows as she listened, watched the color change. 10 seconds. Maybe 12. Shane lowered the phone. She didn't say anything immediately. She looked at the screen, then up at Dove. And in that look, Dove saw something she had not seen on her sister's face all morning. Not during the ignored questions, not during Peter's insult, not during the full 57 minutes of deliberate erasure upstairs. She saw fear. Shane turned the screen toward her. It was a text from Ronald Osley. 4 lines. Clean and direct, the way Ronald communicated everything. Because Ronald had been a federal prosecutor for 14 years and had never once in his life used 3 words when 2 would do. Call me now. Someone leaked the Apex internal investment memo to Nova Bridge's board. Full terms. They know your floor, your timeline, and they know you need this deal. Call me. Dove read it once. Then she read it again. The morning air felt different suddenly. The same temperature, the same gray October sky, but with something in it that hadn't been there 8 seconds ago. A weight. The specific, familiar weight of a situation becoming larger and more dangerous than it appeared on the surface. The memo was not a general document. It was internal, restricted. It contained Apex Capital's maximum investment threshold, the absolute ceiling of what Dove was authorized to commit. It contained her 3 non-negotiable contractual conditions, and it contained the detail that almost no one outside of Apex's senior team knew: a 60-day hard deadline tied to the pension fund consortium. If Dove did not deploy the capital within 60 days, the consortium held a clause, buried deep in their partnership agreement, that allowed them to invoke a full fund withdrawal. Hundreds of millions. Gone. With that information, Nova Bridge didn't need to negotiate. They just needed to wait. Dove stared at the text for a long moment. Then she looked up at the building they had just walked out of. 42 floors of glass and steel, rising into a white Chicago sky. Call Ronald, she said quietly. Tell him we're on our way. She got into the car. Ronald Osley's office was nothing like the Nova Bridge conference room. No mahogany table the length of a school bus. No floor-to-ceiling windows designed to make visitors feel small. Just a wide, cluttered desk covered in organized stacks of paper, 2 whiteboards filled with tight, precise handwriting, and the particular kind of quiet that belongs to a room where serious work gets done. A half-empty pot of coffee sat on the credenza. Ronald had clearly been there since early morning. He was standing at the whiteboard when Dove and Shane walked in. He didn't offer pleasantries. Ronald never did when something was wrong. He simply turned, looked at Dove with the steady, careful expression she had known since she was 24 years old, and pointed to the chairs across from his desk. Sit down, he said. Both of you. They sat. Ronald picked up a thick manila folder from his desk and set it in front of Dove without opening it. Then he turned back to the whiteboard and tapped a column of names and timestamps he had already written out. The memo was accessed 6 days ago, he said. Tuesday evening, 7:43 p.m., from inside the Apex network. He paused. Whoever pulled it knew exactly where to find it. They didn't search around. They went straight to it, downloaded it once, and closed the session in under 4 minutes. Shane leaned forward. So it wasn't a hack. No, Ronald said. This wasn't someone breaking in from the outside. This was someone who already had the key. The word someone sat in the room like smoke. Ronald turned back to his whiteboard and walked them through the damage, slowly, methodically, the way he always delivered bad news, which was without softening it. The memo, he explained, was not a summary document. It was the full internal investment brief that Dove's senior team had prepared ahead of the Nova Bridge discussions, the kind of document that existed only so the right people inside Apex could stay aligned. It contained 3 things that, in the wrong hands, were not just sensitive. They were weapons. The first was Dove's maximum investment threshold, the absolute ceiling of what Apex was authorized to commit to this deal. Nova Bridge now knew the highest number Dove could offer, which meant they knew there was no point negotiating above it, which meant every conversation going forward would start at the ceiling instead of the floor. The second was Dove's 3 non-negotiable contractual conditions, the specific governance and oversight terms she required before any deployment of this size. Conditions she had intended to introduce as part of a strategic negotiation. Now, Nova Bridge could prepare responses, workarounds, and counter-arguments before she ever opened her mouth. And the third, Ronald said, his voice dropping slightly, is the 60-day clause. Shane closed her eyes briefly. Dove said nothing. Ronald turned to face them both fully. They know about the consortium deadline. They know that if you don't deploy within 60 days, the pension fund consortium can invoke the withdrawal clause. They know what that withdrawal costs Apex. And they know, he set his pen down on the edge of the whiteboard tray, that you have no viable alternative deployment of this size that could close in time. The room was quiet for a moment. Dove understood what Ronald was telling her. She had understood it in the car on the way over, working through the implications the way she worked through everything, systematically, without panic, looking at each piece and placing it where it belonged. Understanding a problem clearly was not the same as accepting it. It was simply the first step toward solving it. With this memo, she said, they don't need to negotiate. No, Ronald said. They just need to stall. Run out your clock. Let the consortium clause do the work for them. Shane pressed her fingers against her temple. So, the whole thing this morning? Gilbert performing the big welcome, acting like he suddenly remembered she was in the room? That was already theater. They already knew they had the leverage. Most likely, Ronald said. Dove picked up the manila folder and opened it. Inside was the access log, timestamps, user credentials, download records. She turned to the page Ronald had flagged with a yellow tab, a column of names, authorized personnel with access to the restricted investment brief. She ran her finger down the list. She stopped. The name sat there in plain black type, perfectly ordinary, completely unremarkable. Dean Scott, Head of Partnerships. Access confirmed. Tuesday, 7:43 p.m. Dove stared at it for a long moment. Then she closed the folder, set it carefully on Ronald's desk, and looked up at the whiteboard with the still, focused expression of a woman who has just located exactly where the problem began. Dove was at her desk by 7 the next morning. Her office at Apex Capital was on the 31st floor of a building 6 blocks from Nova Bridge, close enough that on a clear day you could see their glass tower from her window. She had chosen the location deliberately when she signed the lease 7 years ago. She had always believed it was useful to be able to see the places you intended to outlast. Ronald arrived at 7:15 with a cardboard coffee cup in one hand and a laptop bag over his shoulder. He didn't knock. He had never knocked. He set his coffee on the edge of her desk, opened his laptop, and turned the screen to face her. I had my IT contact run the full overnight audit, he said. Access logs, outgoing emails, phone records, everything. Dove looked at the screen. The evidence was not complicated. It was not ambiguous. It was the specific, clean, damning clarity of a man who had been careful enough to cover his tracks, but not careful enough to understand how thoroughly tracks could be uncovered. Dean Scott had accessed the restricted investment memo on Tuesday evening. They already knew that. What the overnight audit added was the next step, At 8:02 p.m., 19 minutes after accessing the document, he had forwarded it from his personal email account, not his Apex account, his personal one, to an address Ronald's contact had traced back to a consulting firm with one listed client, Nova Bridge Technologies. "There's more," Ronald said. He scrolled down. 2 phone calls, both from Dean's personal cell. First one was 12 days ago, 11 minutes, to a direct line registered to a Nova Bridge board contact named Wendell. Second one was 4 days ago, 6 minutes, same number. The day after the memo was forwarded, Shane was standing by the window with her arms folded. She had been standing there since Ronald started talking, very still, very quiet, in the way she got quiet when she was furious enough that moving felt dangerous. "He auditioned," she said. Her voice was flat. "He handed them our entire strategy as a job application." "That's what the timeline suggests," Ronald said. 4 years, Shane said, turning from the window. "Dove, he has worked here for 4 years. You brought him in. You promoted him. I know," Dove said. "We need to fire him. Today. Right now. And then we call our legal team and we—" "No." The word was quiet, completely final. Shane stopped. "What?" Dove leaned back in her chair and looked at Ronald. "If we fire him today, Nova Bridge knows within the hour that we found the breach. They pull Dean out of the equation. They deny everything. And we spend the next 6 weeks in discovery while our 60-day clock runs down to nothing." She paused. "We don't fire him." Ronald was already nodding slowly. He had worked with Dove long enough to know when she was 3 moves ahead and was waiting for the board to catch up. "We promote him," Dove said. Shane stared at her. "You cannot be serious. A new role, special projects, something that sounds important, keeps him close, and gives us complete visibility into everything he communicates." Dove turned her pen over once in her fingers. "And then we feed him information. Carefully selected, completely false information about our timeline, our revised offer terms, and our backup plan. He takes it straight to Nova Bridge. You want to use him as a pipeline," Ronald said. "I want to turn their weapon into mine," Dove said simply. The room was quiet for a moment. Shane pressed her fingers to her forehead. "Dove, if this goes wrong—" "Document everything," Dove said to Ronald. "Every piece of false information we feed him, every communication, every timestamp. We build the record while he builds his case against himself." She stood, straightening her jacket. "By the time he realizes what happened, we won't need to fire him. He'll have done it to himself." Ronald picked up his coffee. "I'll have the framework for the civil complaint ready within the week, just in case." "Have it ready sooner," Dove said. She walked out of her office, down the corridor, and stopped in front of the closed door with the nameplate that read Dean Scott, Head of Partnerships. She could see him through the narrow glass panel beside the door, sitting at his desk, coffee in hand, completely unbothered. The specific ease of a man who believed he had not been caught. She knocked twice, light and friendly. Dean looked up. His expression arranged itself into its usual pleasant professionalism. Dove opened the door and smiled warmly. "Dean," she said, "I've been thinking about your future here." It arrived 2 days after Dean's promotion. A courier. Not an email, not a fax. An actual courier in a dark jacket, with a sealed envelope bearing the Nova Bridge corporate seal pressed into burgundy wax. The kind of delivery designed to communicate something beyond its contents. A statement of formality. A declaration that whatever came next was official and deliberate, and had been decided by people who believed they were untouchable. Dove's assistant brought it to her at 10:47 a.m. without comment. Dove set down the report she was reading, picked up a letter opener and sliced the envelope clean across the top. She read it once. Then she called Ronald. He was there within the hour. The document was 4 pages, dense with legal language and corporate courtesy. The kind of writing designed to make something ugly look reasonable by dressing it in enough formal vocabulary that you had to read it twice to find the knife. Dove had read it 3 times by the time Ronald arrived. She knew exactly where the knife was. She set it in front of him without a word. Ronald read in silence. The only sound in the room was the faint noise of the city 31 floors below, and the occasional turn of a page. When he finished, he set the document down, took off his reading glasses, and pressed 2 fingers against the bridge of his nose. 10 business days, he said. 10, Dove confirmed. The ultimatum was structured around 2 options presented as though they were equally reasonable. Option 1, Apex Capital accepts Nova Bridge's original investment terms as written, which meant surrendering the board observer rights Dove had negotiated, eliminating all 3 of her contractual conditions, and accepting a governance structure that gave Nova Bridge's leadership virtually unchecked authority over how the capital was deployed. Option 2, if Apex Capital declined or failed to respond within 10 business days, Nova Bridge would release a formal public statement to the financial press, citing the breakdown of discussions due to, and here was the phrase, buried in the 3rd paragraph like a splinter beneath clean skin, incompatible investment philosophies and concerns regarding principal-level decision-making capacity. Ronald tapped the phrase with 1 finger. You understand what that means in this industry. Tell me anyway, Dove said. I want to hear it out loud. Ronald leaned back. In finance, that phrase is a code. It doesn't say anything legally actionable. It doesn't have to. What it communicates to every institutional player, every board, every fund manager who reads it, is this. Apex Capital's principle is difficult, unstable. Not someone you want controlling large capital in a high-stakes partnership, he paused. It poisons the well, not just for this deal, for the next 12 months of deal flow, maybe longer. And the decision-making capacity line, Shane said from the corner of the room. Her voice was carefully controlled. That's aimed specifically at Dove, not the firm, her. Yes, Ronald said simply. Shane stood up. That is not a counter-proposal. That is a threat. That's exactly what it is, Ronald said. And it's been used before. He turned back to Dove. I pulled Peter Wendale's history while I was waiting for the car. 2 prior instances. A female-led infrastructure fund out of Atlanta, 2019. A women-owned investment group in Boston, 2021. Both times, the same language, the same 10-day window, the same public statement when they didn't comply. Did it work? Dove asked. Both times, Ronald said. The Atlanta fund lost 2 institutional partners within 90 days of the statement. The Boston group folded their infrastructure division entirely within a year. The room was quiet. Gilbert Hogan's name was printed at the top of the letterhead, his signature at the bottom, clean and practiced. But the architecture of this document was not Gilbert's. Gilbert was 34 years old and desperate to close a deal to impress his father. This was not desperation. This was a calculated, practiced demolition, the work of a man who had done this before, who knew precisely how much damage the right words in the right publication could do to a woman in finance, and who had used that knowledge as a weapon more than once. This was Peter Wendale. Dove picked up the document, read the 3rd paragraph 1 more time, and then set it on the corner of her desk with the careful, deliberate placement of something she intended to keep. Evidence had its own value. She had learned that a long time ago. She turned to face the Chicago skyline through the floor-to-ceiling window. The Nova Bridge Tower was visible 6 blocks north, glass catching the gray October light. She looked at it for a long moment. Then we make sure, she said quietly. It doesn't work this time. Dove did not sleep much that week, not because she was afraid. Fear was not the thing keeping her awake at 5 a.m. with a legal pad on her kitchen counter and a cold cup of coffee at her elbow. It was focus. The kind of deep, consuming focus that had carried her from a Baltimore kitchen table to a 31st-floor office. The kind that didn't leave room for rest when there was still work to be done. She had 10 business days. She intended to use every single one of them. The first move was Ronald's. She called him the morning after the courier letter arrived and gave him one instruction: pull every SEC quarterly filing Novabridge had submitted in the last 5 years and go through them line by line. Not for general irregularities. For the Southeast Corridor specifically, the liability gap Dove had raised in the meeting, the one Gilbert had redirected away from her with a patronizing smile and an analyst's rehearsed detour. Ronald called back on the third day. "Dove," he said, and his voice had the particular, careful quality it took on when he was about to say something significant. "Your instinct was right. The Southeast Corridor gap isn't isolated. I've found 3 separate quarterly reports: Q3 2 years ago, Q1 last year, and Q2 this year, where the liability exposure was materially understated. Not rounding errors, not accounting adjustments. Deliberate omissions." Dove pressed the phone closer. "Peter's signature?" "On all 3, Ronald said. She wrote it down, underlined it twice. Alone, Ronald explained, each instance was defensible in court. A skilled attorney could argue oversight, misclassification, clerical error. But 3 instances, across 3 separate reporting periods, each understating the same specific liability corridor, each signed by the same man. That was not an accident. That was a pattern. And patterns, Ronald said, were what the SEC's Enforcement Division lived for. "How solid is it?" Dove asked. "Solid enough to file," Ronald said. "I'll have the referral package ready within the week." The second move was quieter. Dove made 2 phone calls on a Tuesday afternoon, both to women she had met years earlier at an institutional investment conference in Washington. She had not spoken to either of them recently, but in this industry, the right relationships had long memories. The first was a woman named Patty Oscar, a sovereign wealth fund advisor based in New York, who had considered a partnership with Novabridge 3 years prior. The second was Margaret Hazen, a pension fund manager out of Atlanta whose firm had evaluated a Novabridge infrastructure proposal in 2021. Both women had non-disclosure agreements. Both women also had something NDAs could not silence: the willingness to confirm, off the record and through careful language, that their experiences with Novabridge's leadership had followed a pattern that felt very familiar when Dove described it. Neither woman would speak on record. Not yet. But Dove had already been in quiet contact with a journalist at the Wall Street Journal, a woman named Claire Stevens, who covered institutional investment and had been building a piece on gender bias in infrastructure finance for several months. Claire had sources, she had documentation. What she needed was the thread that tied it all together into something publishable. Dove gave her Patty's and Margaret's names. She made no promises and issued no instructions. She simply said, "I think they have something to tell you. Whether they tell you is their decision." Claire Stevens called back 48 hours later. Both women had agreed to speak. Margaret Hazen had agreed to go fully on record. Dove thanked her and ended the call. The third move was the most satisfying. Dean Scott had settled comfortably into his new special projects role, which was to say, he had settled comfortably into the business of believing he was invisible. He attended his new briefings. He smiled in the hallways. He sent Novabridge everything Dove gave him. That week, Dove gave him 3 things: a falsified revised timeline suggesting Apex was close to identifying an alternative deployment, a fabricated counteroffer figure $20 million below her actual floor, and a memo, carefully constructed, thoroughly false, indicating that the pension fund consortium had granted an informal extension on the 60-day deadline. None of it was true. Every word of it was time-stamped, documented, and stored in Ronald's growing file. Within 72 hours, Novabridge's behavior shifted in ways Dove's contacts confirmed. They stopped pushing. They slowed their response times. They believed they had more runway than they did. They were wrong. Ronald looked up from his legal pad on Friday evening. The whiteboards behind him were covered in neat columns. Evidence categories, filing timelines, contact names, documented instances. He set his pen down. looked at Dove across the desk. "Dove," he said quietly, "I think we have them." Dove looked at the whiteboards for a long moment. "Not yet," she said, "but soon." The email arrived on a Thursday morning, 3 weeks after the Nova Bridge meeting. It came not from Gilbert Hogan, not from Peter Wendell, not from Carmela Lindstrom. It came from the personal email address of a man named Robert Adley, Nova Bridge board member, 22 years in infrastructure finance, and by all accounts, one of the few people in that building who had built his reputation on something other than inherited connections and old boy favors. The message was 4 sentences long. He and a fellow board member, a woman named Louise Tran, had become aware of certain developments regarding the Apex Capital discussions. They believed the current negotiating approach did not reflect Nova Bridge's best interests or its values. They would like to meet with Dove directly, without Gilbert, without Peter, without any member of current executive leadership present, at her office, at her convenience. Dove read it twice. Then she forwarded it to Ronald with a single line. "Thoughts?" Ronald called within 10 minutes. His voice was measured, but she could hear something underneath it. The careful, controlled excitement of a man who had been building toward something and could now see the finish line. "The board is fracturing," he said. "Adley has been skeptical of Gilbert's leadership for months. I've heard it through 2 separate contacts. If he and Tran are reaching out directly, it means they've lost confidence in the current team's ability to close this. They want the deal. They just don't want the people negotiating it." "Which means," Dove said, "which means Gilbert and Peter are being cut out by their own board," Ronald said. "Dove, this is exactly where you need them to be." She replied to Adley's email that afternoon. Confirmed availability. Suggested the following Tuesday at 10:20 a.m. His response came back in under an hour. "Confirmed. We'll be there." That evening, Dove called Shane from home. Not from the office. Not on the work line. From her living room, shoes off, feet tucked under her on the couch, a glass of water on the coffee table that she kept forgetting to drink. The kind of call that had nothing to do with deal structures or legal filings or carefully documented evidence files. Shane answered on the second ring. "How are you?" "Tired," Dove said. "Good tired." "The board email." "Yeah." Shane was quiet for a moment. Then, "Mama would have something to say about all of this." Dove laughed. It was a real laugh, the sudden, unguarded kind that surprised her when it came. She would have said something short and devastating, and then gone back to whatever she was doing. "She always did that," Shane said, and there was warmth in her voice and something softer underneath it. "Remember when you got your first rejection from Wharton and she just looked at you and said, 'So you'll apply again?' and then went back to folding laundry? Didn't even put the shirt down," Dove said. They were quiet together for a moment, the comfortable quiet of 2 people who had shared enough history that silence between them had its own texture. Dove thought about that kitchen table, the one in Baltimore where she had sat at 22 years old, filling out her Wharton application for the second time, while her mother's night shift bus schedule was pinned to the refrigerator with a magnet shaped like a pineapple. She had told herself that night that she would build something. She hadn't known exactly what. She had just known it would be hers. "We're close, Shane," she said. "I know," Shane said. "I know we are." They talked for another 20 minutes about nothing important. A television show Shane had been watching. A restaurant near Dove's building that had changed its menu. A memory about their mother that made them both laugh again. For 20 minutes they were not executives, not strategists, not 2 women 3 weeks into the fight of their professional lives. They were just sisters from Baltimore. Dove was at her desk by 8 the next morning, Adley's confirmation email open on her screen, a fresh legal pad in front of her as she prepared her notes for Tuesday's meeting. The door to her office opened. It was Shane. She was standing in the doorway, with her phone in her hand, and an expression Dove had not seen on her face since that elevator ride 3 weeks ago. The color drained from her cheeks, her jaw set, with the particular tightness of someone working very hard to hold something together. Dove! Something in her voice made Dove set her pen down. Shane crossed the room and held out the phone. Peter Wendell just released a statement to the financial press, she said. Dove, it's bad. Dove took the phone. She read the statement standing up, the way you absorb a blow better on your feet than sitting down. Shane stood across from her, arms folded, watching her sister's face the way you watch a building during an earthquake, looking for the cracks. There were none. Not on the outside. Peter Wendell's statement was 3 paragraphs. Clean, formal, and precisely devastating. It did not use offensive language. It did not make accusations it couldn't technically defend. It was far smarter than that. It used suggestion the way a surgeon uses a scalpel. Thin, targeted, designed to cause maximum damage in the places that mattered most. The first paragraph announced that Nova Bridge Technologies had concluded discussions with Apex Capital Group following an extended review period. Standard language. Expected. The second paragraph was the weapon. It expressed Nova Bridge's commitment to partnerships built on aligned governance values and stable principal-level leadership, and noted that the discussions had ultimately revealed concerns regarding decision-making authority and internal oversight structures within Apex Capital. The third paragraph wished Apex Capital well in its future endeavors. Dove set the phone on her desk. Decision-making authority, Shane said, her voice trembling at the edges. Internal oversight structures. Dove, they're telling every institutional player in this industry that you don't have control of your own firm. I know what they're saying. And the timing. Releasing it the morning after Adley emails you directly? Peter found out about the board contact. He's trying to burn the ground before you can stand on it. Dove didn't answer. She was already thinking. She moved to her window and looked north toward the Nova Bridge Tower, 6 blocks away, glass catching the gray morning light the same way it always did. Her phone began ringing at 11:40 a.m. By noon, it had rung 9 times. Institutional partners, board observers, 2 fund managers she had worked with for years, asking careful, diplomatic questions that were really just one question dressed in different clothes. Is everything all right over there? She returned every call. Her voice was steady. Her answers were measured. She gave nothing away. At 1:15 p.m., 3 major financial news outlets published pieces that clearly drew from Peter's statement. Not front-page stories. They didn't need to be. They were placed in the industry sections where the people who mattered would find them without searching. The language mirrored Peter's carefully. Sources close to the deal. Questions regarding principal oversight. He had cultivated these journalists for years. Dove had known he had them. She had not known he would move this fast. By 2:00 p.m., she had 17 missed calls. At 4:12 p.m., her email notified her of an incoming document from the Pension Fund Consortium's legal team. She opened it. The consortium was invoking their reputational concerns provision, a clause buried deep in the partnership agreement that allowed acceleration of the 60-day deadline if a third-party statement raised material questions about Apex Capital's leadership stability. Peter had known about that clause. Dove was certain of it now. The statement hadn't just been a reputation attack. It had been a key, custom cut to fit a specific lock. She no longer had 60 days. She had 14. She was still reading the legal notice when her assistant appeared in the doorway. "Ms. Wermer-Hartson," he said carefully, "there's something on the newswire you need to see." He handed her a printed page. Dean Scott had issued a public statement. He had resigned from Apex Capital, effective immediately, and had provided a comment to 2 financial publications. The comment described Dove as an erratic decision-maker who had allowed personal grievances to override professional judgment and had single-handedly collapsed a transformative deal that would have benefited everyone involved. It was the false intelligence she had fed him, woven throughout. The fabricated timeline, the invented alternative deployment, the fake consortium extension, all of it embedded in his statement as though it were fact. Every false detail was traceable. Every timestamp existed. The proof that he had obtained that information by betraying her confidence was sitting in Ronald's files right now. But proof took time, and the damage was already moving. Dove stood at her window as the city began switching on its evening lights, block by block, the skyline slowly brightening against a darkening sky. 17 missed calls, a 14-day window, a statement built on stolen intelligence, 3 financial outlets amplifying a lie. She stood there for a long time. She did not move. She was not defeated. She knew the difference between devastated and defeated, had known it since she was 22 years old at a kitchen table in Baltimore, filling out an application for the second time after the first one came back wrong. She picked up her phone and called Ronald. He answered on the first ring. "I saw it," he said. "Good," Dove said. "Then you know what comes next." She drove to Baltimore alone. She didn't plan it. She finished Ronald's call, stood at her office window until the last light in the Nova Bridge Tower went dark, and then she got her coat, told Earl she wouldn't need the car, and walked to the parking garage. She drove south out of Chicago, onto the interstate, into the night. 4 hours and change. She stopped once for gas and bad coffee and kept moving. She needed to think. She always thought better when she was moving. By the time she reached Baltimore, it was past midnight. The old neighborhood was quiet. The particular quiet of streets that have seen enough that nothing surprises them anymore. She parked in front of the row house she had grown up in and still owned, the one she had bought from her mother 8 years ago, so her mother would never have to worry about a landlord again. The lights were off. The street was still. She let herself in with her key. She did not turn on many lights, just the one above the kitchen table, a small, warm circle of yellow in the dark. She sat down, opened her laptop, and went to work. She had 3 hours before Ronald would be up. She used all of them. The thing about Dean Scott's statement was that he had made a specific, critical mistake. He was a man who believed he was the smartest person in any room he entered, and that belief had made him careless in the way that only truly arrogant people are careless. Not in small ways, but in the one catastrophic way that undoes everything. He had used her words against her. The fabricated timeline, the invented alternative deployment, the false consortium extension. Dove had constructed each piece of false intelligence with precision, feeding it to Dean through his new special projects role over a period of carefully spaced days. Each piece had been documented the moment it left her hands, timestamped, logged, stored in Ronald's files with the methodical care of someone who had known, from the beginning, that this was where it was going. Dean's public statement repeated those fabrications as established fact, which meant every false claim in his statement could be traced directly and irrefutably to information he had obtained by stealing from Dove and used to publicly destroy her. That was not just a civil matter. That was a case. She spent the first hour building the timeline document, a clean, chronological record of every piece of false intelligence she had created, the date she fed it to Dean, the documented method of delivery, and the corresponding line in his public statement where he had deployed it. Side by side, irrefutable, the kind of document that required no explanation because it explained itself completely. The second hour she spent reviewing Ronald's SEC referral package, which he had emailed her as a PDF attachment 3 days ago, and which she had read twice already. She read it a third time now. 47 pages, 5 years of Nova Bridge quarterly filings, 3 instances of material omission, Peter Wendale's signature on everyone. The Southeast Corridor liability gap she had identified in the meeting, the one Gilbert had redirected away from her with his nice and simple comment, was the first thread. Ronald had pulled it and found the whole fabric coming apart. The referral was airtight. She knew it. Ronald knew it. She approved the final language on page 31, and marked it ready to file. The third hour she spent reading Claire Stevens's draft Wall Street Journal piece, which Claire had sent for a final courtesy review the previous week. Dove had asked for 48 hours to consider it. She had taken longer than that because everything else had been burning. She read it now in the quiet of her mother's kitchen, under the small warm light, with the kind of concentrated attention the piece deserved. It was good. It was more than good. Claire had done the work, the documented pattern, the timeline, the on-record testimony from Margaret Hazen, the confirmed off-record account from Patty Oscar, the language analysis comparing Peter's public statements across 3 separate cases spanning 11 years. She had not sensationalized it. She hadn't needed to. The facts were sensational enough on their own. Dove typed one line in response, "You have my authorization. Run it when you're ready." She sent the email at 5:47 a.m. Then she closed the laptop and sat back in the chair. Her mother's chair, at her mother's table, in the kitchen where she had sat at 22 years old and told herself she would build something that was entirely hers. She looked at the wall across from her. Her mother's embroidery, framed in plain wood, hung exactly where it had always hung. "Still I rise." She picked up her phone and called Ronald at exactly 6 a.m. He answered before the second ring. She had known he would. Ronald had never once in 20 years made her wait when it mattered. "The timeline document is in your inbox," she said. "The SEC referral is approved and ready to file. And I've authorized the journal piece." A brief pause on his end. Not hesitation. Just Ronald absorbing the full weight of what she was saying. "All 3, he said. "Today." "All 3, Dove said. "Do it now." "Understood," Ronald said. She set the phone on the table. Outside, the Baltimore sky was beginning to change. The deep dark of 6 a.m. giving way to the first thin gray light of morning, slow and quiet and completely indifferent to the battles of the people below it. Dove wrapped both hands around her coffee cup and watched the sun come up. Ronald filed at 9:01 a.m. sharp. 47 pages. 5 years of evidence. 3 documented instances of material omission across Nova Bridge's quarterly SEC filings, each one understating the same Southeast Corridor liability exposure, each one bearing Peter Wendell's signature at the bottom like a confession he had signed without knowing it. Ronald had formatted the referral package with the precise, unadorned clarity of a former federal prosecutor. No dramatic language, no editorial commentary, just facts arranged in an order that made the conclusion completely unavoidable. The SEC's Chicago Regional Office acknowledged receipt at 9:23 a.m. By 11 a.m., they had opened a preliminary inquiry. Ronald texted Dove 2 words, "It's open." She was sitting at her Chicago office desk when the text arrived, back from Baltimore since early morning, jacket on, legal pad in front of her. She read the message, set the phone down, and kept working. There was no celebration. There was no exhale of relief. There was only the next thing, and the next thing after that. She had learned a long time ago that the moment you stop moving is the moment the ground catches up with you. What mattered about the preliminary inquiry was not what it contained. It was what it was. The moment the SEC opened it, the inquiry became a matter of public record, visible, searchable, permanent. Every institutional investor, every board member, every financial journalist who ran Peter Wendell's name through a database would find it sitting there like a stone in clean water. Not an accusation, not a rumor, a federal filing, official, documented, irrefutable. Peter Wendell's careful, practiced reputation, 30 years of cultivated credibility, board seats, and old boy relationships, had just developed a crack that no press statement could seal. The Wall Street Journal piece published at 7 a.m. Thursday morning. Claire Stevens had timed it deliberately. Early enough to own the morning news cycle, late enough in the week that it would carry through the weekend when financial readers had time to sit with it. The headline was clean and direct. No sensationalism. No inflammatory language. Just the specific, documented truth, laid out in the particular devastating style of a journalist who understood that facts, properly arranged, were more damaging than any opinion. The piece documented a pattern. Not a single incident. Not one bad meeting or one mishandled deal. A pattern. 3 cases, spanning 11 years, in which Peter Wendell and Nova Bridge affiliated entities had used coordinated media pressure, carefully planted financial press narratives, and the specific incompatible investment philosophies language to suppress, discredit, and ultimately damage female-led investment firms that had challenged their terms. The Atlanta Fund, the Boston Group, and now Apex Capital. Margaret Hazen spoke fully on the record. Her account was precise, credible, and damning, not because it was dramatic, but because it was identical in its structure to what Dove had experienced. The same language, the same 10-day ultimatum, the same coordinated press placement within 48 hours of declining Nova Bridge's terms, the same phrase, decision-making capacity, deployed like a scalpel against a woman who had built her firm from nothing. Patty Oscar spoke off the record, but with enough specificity that her account added unmistakable weight. Claire had also obtained, through sources Dove was not asked to identify, internal Nova Bridge communications showing that the incompatible philosophies language had been drafted by Peter Wendell personally, not as a response to any actual incompatibility, but as a prepared template, ready to deploy against any investment principal who declined his terms. A template, pre-written, kept on file. By noon Thursday, the article was the most read piece on the journal's site. Dove's assistant brought her a printout without being asked. She read it at her desk and set it in the growing file beside Ronald's SEC referral. By Friday morning, 17 other outlets had republished or referenced it. 3 television financial news programs ran segments. The language shifted noticeably. Peter Wendell's name was no longer preceded by respected or veteran. It was preceded by embattled. FINRA opened a separate inquiry into Peter Wendell's affiliated entities before the week was out. 3 of his 4 public company board seats were quietly vacated within 30 days. Companies moving fast and quietly. The way institutions move when they want to create distance without appearing to panic. Peter Wendell released a statement through his lawyers calling the allegations politically motivated. Not a single financial publication repeated that characterization without placing it in quotation marks. That afternoon, in Nova Bridge's open plan office on the 38th floor, a process server walked through the front entrance and asked the receptionist for Dean Scott by name. Across the floor, heads turned. Dean looked up from his desk. The process server crossed the room and placed the civil complaint in his hands at 10:15 a.m. on a Tuesday. Ronald's filing, charging breach of fiduciary duty and defamation, with every timestamp, every documented exchange, every piece of false intelligence neatly catalogued as an exhibit. Dean's face went the color of old paper. Around him, the entire floor had gone completely, absolutely silent. Dean Scott did not move for a full 10 seconds. He sat at his desk, with the civil complaint in both hands, the process server already walking back toward the elevator, and 31 colleagues pretending with extraordinary effort not to stare at him from across the open floor. The document was 43 pages. Ronald did not write thin complaints. He wrote the kind that landed like architecture. Solid, immovable, designed to stand up under any pressure applied to them. Dean set it on his desk, then he picked it up again. Then he set it down. Someone across the floor coughed. Someone else found something very interesting to look at on their computer screen. The particular excruciating silence of an open-plan office that has just witnessed something it will be discussing for months settled over the room like a held breath. Dean's new Nova Bridge contact, the board liaison who had promised him the senior advisory role that had never actually been formalized, did not return his call that afternoon, or the next morning. By Wednesday, the extension rang through to a generic voicemail that had not been set up yet. His promised role at Nova Bridge evaporated without a meeting, without a conversation, without the professional courtesy of a single written explanation. One day, it existed. The next day, it did not. That was how institutions abandoned people when the ground shifted, quickly, cleanly, and without looking back. The Nova Bridge Board convened an emergency session on Thursday morning. Hugo Hogan sat at the far end of the table. Not at the head. That seat had belonged to Gilbert for 8 months. But at the far end, in the chair he had occupied as a board observer since handing his son the provisional CEO title in February. He had attended every board meeting since then with the careful, quiet attention of a man watching an investment he was not entirely certain would pay off. He watched this one differently. The agenda was short and brutal. The SEC preliminary inquiry was public record. The Wall Street Journal piece had been read by every person in that room and by every institutional partner Nova Bridge had. FINRA had opened its separate inquiry into Peter Wendell. 3 board members who had previously been reliable Peter allies had spent the last 48 hours conspicuously not returning his calls. Robert Adley, who had reached out to Dove 3 weeks ago, spoke first. His voice was measured and without pleasure, the tone of a man doing something necessary, rather than something satisfying. The flagship deal is gone under current leadership. Our institutional confidence metrics are in freefall. We have a federal filing with Peter's name on it and a journal piece that has been republished 17 times. He paused. The path forward does not include the people who created this situation. No one disagreed. The vote to remove Gilbert Hogan as CEO was not dramatic. It was quiet and fast, and decided before anyone said the word vote out loud. The board resolution cited the need for stable transitional leadership during a period of institutional realignment. The press release, issued 90 minutes later, used the phrase to pursue other opportunities. The financial world was not fooled. Hugo Hogan did not speak during the session. He voted with the board because he was a man who had spent 40 years in business and knew, at the cellular level, when something was over. He sat very still afterward, while the room emptied around him, with the expression of a man absorbing the full weight of a decision he had made 8 months ago out of love and pride, and the very human inability to tell his own son the truth. He had given Gilbert a crown the boy had not earned. He had watched him wear it badly. And now he was sitting in a room where the consequence of that decision had been officially, formally, publicly recorded. Nobody offered him comfort. Nobody was unkind. They simply gathered their papers and filed out, leaving Hugo Hogan alone at the far end of a long table with nothing but the quiet and whatever he intended to do with it. At 3:45 p.m., Gilbert Hogan walked out of Nova Bridge Technologies' front entrance, carrying a single cardboard box. He was wearing the same suit he had worn to the board session that morning. His tie was slightly loosened. He walked to the curb, set the box down, and stood there for a moment looking up at the building's glass facade, with an expression that was difficult to read from a distance. Then he picked up the box. The revolving door turned once behind him. Then it stopped. Then the building went on without him, the way buildings always do, completely indifferent to whoever has just walked out of them for the last time. Agnes Carter arrived 7 minutes early. Dove noticed. Small things like that had always told her more about a person than anything they said in a formal setting. Agnes was 56 years old, 30 years in infrastructure finance, and she had accepted the interim CEO role at Nova Bridge 4 days after Gilbert Hogan carried his cardboard box to the curb. She came with 2 board members, Robert Adley and Louise Tran, and she came to Dove's office, not a neutral location, not a restaurant or a hotel conference room. Dove's building, Dove's floor, Dove's table. That had been Agnes's suggestion. Dove's assistant showed them into the conference room at 10:15 a.m. exactly. Dove was already seated. Shane sat to her right, portfolio open, pen in hand, the same position she had occupied in the Nova Bridge conference room 5 weeks ago, except that this time every person walking through the door knew exactly who the decision-maker was before they sat down. Agnes did not open with pleasantries. She did not reach for the water pitcher or adjust her chair, or make the small, stalling movements of someone buying time before a difficult conversation. She sat down, folded her hands on the table, and looked directly at Dove. "Before we discuss anything else," she said, "I want to say something clearly and without qualification." She paused. "Not for effect, for precision. The way people pause when they want to be sure the words they choose are exactly the right ones. What happened in our conference room 5 weeks ago was inexcusable. The way you were treated by this company's leadership was a disgrace. I am not here to explain it or minimize it. I am here to tell you, on behalf of this board, that we know what it was, and we are sorry." The room was quiet. Shane looked at her sister. Dove held Agnes's gaze for a long moment, long enough to confirm that the words were not performance, that they were not the careful, lawyer-approved language of an institution managing liability. They were just the truth, spoken plainly by a woman who understood the value of saying it out loud. "Thank you," Dove said. Then she opened her portfolio. The negotiation took 2 hours and 14 minutes. It was not contentious. That was the thing about coming to the table after everything had already happened. There was no posturing left, no leverage games, no carefully constructed ultimatums delivered in embossed envelopes. Just two professionals working through the terms of an agreement with the clear-eyed efficiency of people who understood exactly what they both needed and exactly what it would take to get there. Dove's 3 contractual conditions were reinstated without negotiation. Board observer rights were fully restored. The governance reform clause, requiring Nova Bridge to establish an independent oversight committee with external members, was accepted by Adley and Tran before Dove finished explaining it. The governance clause had not been in the original terms. Dove had added it after everything that had happened. It was not punitive. It was structural, the kind of change that outlasted any single deal, any single leadership team, any single moment of reckoning. It meant that what Gilbert and Peter had built, the particular, practiced culture of unchecked authority that had made all of this possible, could not simply reassemble itself under new names once the attention moved on. Agnes signed it without hesitation. "It's the right thing," she said simply. "It should have been there from the beginning." At 12:14 p.m., both parties signed the final agreement. $700 million. Dove's terms, every one of them. Ronald's text arrived at 6:43 p.m. Dove was sitting at the Baltimore kitchen table when her phone lit up on the worn wooden surface. She had driven down after the signing. Not because she needed to, not because anything required her presence there. Just because it was the right place to be at the end of something this large. Shane sat across from her, shoes off, a cup of tea going cold at her elbow. They had been talking about nothing in particular for the last hour. The easy, rambling conversation of two people who had been through something together and were quietly coming down the other side of it. Dove's phone buzzed. She picked it up. Ronald's message was 11 words. Clean and direct, the way Ronald communicated everything that mattered. "Ink is dry. 700 million. Your terms. All of them." She set the phone down. Shane looked at her. "Well?" Dove looked up at the wall above the kitchen counter. The embroidery hung exactly where it had always hung. Plain wood frame, slightly crooked. Her mother's careful stitching in dark thread against pale fabric. Still, I rise. She had looked at those words at 22, filling out a second application at this same table, while her mother's night shift schedule was pinned to the refrigerator. She had looked at them at 27, the first time a bank told her no. At 30, the morning she signed Apex Capital's incorporation papers alone in a rented office, with a broken chair and a plant she kept forgetting to water. She looked at them now. "Well," she said. She picked up her coffee, took a slow, unhurried sip, and smiled. The real kind. The private kind. The one that belonged only to her, to this kitchen, to the woman who had stitched those words into fabric because she wanted her daughters to have something to look at on the hard days. The one no boardroom had ever gotten to see, and never would. If you enjoyed the story, leave a like to support my channel, and subscribe so that you do not miss out on the next one. On the screen, I have picked 2 special stories just for you. Have a wonderful day.